Beacon Press Audio presents The New Science of Social Change, a modern handbook for activists by Lisa Mueller, Ph.D. This audiobook is narrated by Nichalia Schwartz, published by Beacon Press Audio, 2024. Introduction: The New Science of Social Change. History has shown the power of protest to transform the world. The American and French revolutions spurred experiments in popular rule that resonate to this day. Anti-colonial struggles helped to expel foreign occupiers from Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Union strikes secured fair wages and humane working conditions for generations of laborers. The U.S. Civil Rights Movement culminated in landmark legislation, enhancing the rights and freedoms of African Americans. The Arab Spring and color revolutions in ex-Soviet countries loosened dictators' grips on power. More recently, students from New York to Nairobi walked out of classrooms to draw attention to climate change, forcing their cause to the top of policy agendas. While none of these uprisings completely eradicated any social ills, all were astonishing successes, in light of the odds stacked against activists who were often armed with little more than the symbolic might of their bodies in the streets. It is impossible to count the number of times ordinary folks have fought for and won significant concessions from intransigent authorities. These are the uplifting stories that history books glorify and artists immortalize. Popular culture depicts protesters as selfless defenders of justice and inspirational writers of history. Nations erect statues to honor heroes who vanquished tyrants. Beloved Broadway musicals like Hamilton and Les Miserables romanticize revolutionary sacrifice and bravery. Protesters even reenact roles in real life from popular struggles in the past. In Nicaragua's 2018 revolt against President Daniel Ortega, participants recreated famous episodes from the 1979 Sandinista Revolution. In the wake of the Arab Spring and Occupy Wall Street, Time magazine named The Protester its 2011 Person of the Year. However, as I write this book, protests worldwide are failing at record rates. One doesn't need to look far to find pessimistic counter-narratives lamenting the inability of activists to make meaningful or lasting gains. French revolutionaries had barely tasted democracy before Napoleon declared himself emperor and dragged France into a long period of restored dictatorship. Jubilation surrounding the Arab Spring dissipated as new autocrats clamored to replace ousted ones. Occupy Wall Street, once hailed as a triumph for the 99%, fizzled out before the occupiers could obtain much in the way of economic redistribution or other concrete reforms. The 1965 Voting Rights Act looked like a monumental victory for African Americans and their allies, but sobering research revealed how white communities in the American South responded to the ban on Jim Crow segregation laws by doubling down on incarcerating black citizens. The most cynical interpreters of history argue that dominant groups extend rights to the marginalized only when it is in their interest to do so, such that any apparent step forward for progressives is really no step at all. But cynicism has not gotten the better of activists who soldier on. The turn of the 21st century ushered in an age of mass protests unlike any the world had seen before. From the Hong Kong democracy movement to women's marches to Black Lives Matter, global protest frequency rose by an annual average of 11.5% between 2009 and 2019. This spike eclipsed previous waves of protest, including the turbulent 1960s. Many of the protests capturing headlines during this ongoing wave have involved thousands of participants, sometimes braving tear gas or worse to voice their grievances and lobby decision-makers for concessions, ranging from pensions to free and fair elections. When do such efforts work? Under what conditions do protesters get what they want as opposed to coming up empty-handed or winding up even worse off? These questions are timeless. And not just among scholars or seasoned activists. Plenty of people have at least dabbled in activism, even if only by posting a few words on social media or displaying a bumper sticker on a car. Some individuals have invested dearly in the causes they care about, risking their livelihoods and even their lives at protests, where arrest and physical repression were real dangers. Many more have followed protests from the sidelines, glued to news feeds about the latest outbreak of unrest in a faraway country or their own backyard. No matter how small or great your investment in activism, you might reasonably ask whether it was worth it. Here, I should pause to clarify what I mean by activism. While this book discusses highly visible forms of activism like marches and sit-ins, I follow geographers Susan Hansen, Deborah G. Martin, and Danielle Fontaine by opening the category of activism to consider actions and activities that, because of their limited geographic reach, normally are considered too insignificant to count as activism, and yet have potential to catalyze change. Quiet activism, behind the scenes and underground, figures prominently in this book. Not all activists shout into megaphones. Some, whom we will meet in later chapters, pursue change by supporting comrades on the front lines, clandestinely subverting oppressors, or even by simply existing. Our personal experiences and observations make it tempting to speculate about the causes of protest success or failure. If activists got what they wanted, you might infer that it was because they knew the right slogans to chant, or had strong allies on their side. If activists came up empty-handed, you might blame low turnout at a rally, or a spokesperson's overly aggressive statement to the press. However, what happened in the past is not necessarily the best guide for how to protest in the future. There are two problems with relying on intuition to decide which ways of resisting the status quo are more or less impactful. First, we can't be sure that an experience from one protest applies to protests elsewhere or at other points in time. Perhaps a lawmaker changed her vote in response to a social media post today, but will the same post work next year or on another lawmaker? Would a differently worded bumper sticker solicit the same number of supportive honks? And does it depend on the neighborhood you're driving through? Some protesters in sub-Saharan Africa borrowed mottos from the Arab Spring, but it's unclear whether echoing the cries of Egyptians and Tunisians had any influence on democracy in places like Senegal and Malawi, which differ in numerous ways from the North African countries where the Arab Spring unfolded. As the cliché goes, an anecdote is not a data set. We cannot generalize about how to make protests work by studying one case, or even a handful, in isolation. As science historian Naomi Oreskes affirms, just because someone is close to an issue does not mean he or she understands it. There is a second reason to doubt our intuitions about the ingredients and qualities of successful protest. We can never wind back the clock to see how history would have played out had protesters employed different tactics. Consider the case of the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. Some activists stood up for racial equality by exercising civil resistance, boycotts, sit-ins, and other peaceful gestures endorsed by Martin Luther King Jr. Others took more extreme militant action in self-defense when confronted with police repression and violence, in the tradition of the Black Panthers. These two camps frequently butted heads over which basic approach, restraint or radicalism, was more promising. For decades, laypeople and experts alike could only guess who was right, because they could never observe the counterfactual of a more violent Martin Luther King or a more peaceful Black Panther Party and see how politicians and citizens would have reacted under those hypothetical scenarios. Simply comparing score sheets across the two factions provided few hints, because wings of the civil rights movement varied not just in terms of violence or nonviolence, but also in terms of geographic origin, economic and religious profiles of members, and so on. This difficulty of identifying the cause of an outcome is what social scientists call the fundamental problem of causal inference. It is why activists up until now have had little choice but to select strategies based on their gut instincts about what works, what feels right in the moment, and which actions conform with their tactical identities, for example, as radicals or pacifists. Activists should care about discerning cause and effect. because the potential rewards and losses of
Sample complete. Ready to continue?